Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
Important. The village of Willowbrook had always prided itself on being a place where very little happened. Nestled among rolling hills and ancient oak trees, it was the sort of English village where everyone knew everyone else's business long before it became public knowledge. At the heart of the village stood Willowbrook Parish Church, a centuries-old stone building whose bell tower overlooked the surrounding cottages and fields. It was more than a church. It was the center of village life. The annual Parish Heritage Fair was one of the most anticipated events of the year. Every autumn, villagers gathered on the church grounds to celebrate local history, raise money for charitable causes, and enjoy an afternoon of food, music, and conversation. This year seemed no different. Colorful stalls lined the churchyard. Children ran across the grass. Elderly residents exchanged gossip beneath striped tents. The scent of fresh pastries drifted through the crisp afternoon air. Important. Miss Marple had arrived shortly before noon. She was visiting an old acquaintance, Mrs. Eleanor Finch, and had happily agreed to accompany her to the fair. As always, Miss Marple appeared to be paying little attention to anything beyond her knitting and occasional cups of tea. As always, appearances were deceptive. The parish vicar, Reverend Peter Langley, moved among the guests with practiced charm. A respected figure in Willowbrook, he had served the village for nearly 20 years. Few people had an unkind word to say about him, yet Miss Marple noticed something curious. The vicar seemed distracted. Several times during the afternoon his gaze drifted toward the church entrance. Not once, not twice, repeatedly, as though he expected someone, or feared someone. Nearby stood Margaret Henshaw, chairwoman of the parish council and organizer of the fair. A capable woman in her late 50s, she supervised every detail with military precision, at least outwardly. Important. Beneath her calm smile lurked visible tension. Whenever she crossed paths with Reverend Langley, an awkward silence seemed to form between them. Interesting, very interesting indeed. By 3 o'clock, the fair was in full swing. Musicians performed beside the church hall. Local historians displayed photographs of Willowbrook's past. Villagers wandered from stall to stall enjoying the festivities. Then a visitor arrived. His appearance attracted little attention at first. He was a middle-aged man wearing a dark overcoat despite the mild weather. He carried a leather briefcase and seemed unfamiliar with the village. Several residents assumed he was simply a tourist. Miss Marple did not. The moment Reverend Langley spotted the newcomer, the color drained slightly from his face. The reaction lasted only seconds, but Miss Marple observed it. The stranger approached the vicar directly. The two men exchanged a brief conversation. No raised voices, no obvious confrontation. Important. Yet something about the interaction seemed deeply uncomfortable. When it ended, Reverend Langley appeared shaken. The stranger, however, remained perfectly composed. He spent the next hour wandering around the fairgrounds. Occasionally he spoke with villagers. More often he simply observed, watching, listening, waiting. As the afternoon progressed, whispers began circulating. Nobody seemed certain who the visitor was. Some believed he was connected to the church. Others thought he might be a journalist. One particularly imaginative villager suggested he was conducting a government inspection. No explanation proved convincing. By early evening, preparations began for the final event of the day, a reception inside the parish hall. Guests gathered around long tables decorated with autumn flowers and candles. Conversations resumed. Laughter echoed through the hall. Yet the earlier atmosphere had changed. Something felt wrong. Several people sensed it without understanding why. Important. Reverend Langley spoke little during dinner. Margaret Henshaw appeared increasingly nervous. And the stranger remained quietly attentive to everything happening around him. Shortly after 7 o'clock, the vicar excused himself. He explained that he needed to retrieve some documents from his office inside the church. Nobody found the explanation unusual. A few minutes later, the stranger left as well. This attracted slightly more notice, but not much. The reception continued. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Then the church bell rang unexpectedly. A single loud toll. The sound startled everyone. The bell should not have been ringing, not at that hour. Confused guests exchanged glances. A second toll followed. Then silence. Moments later, the church caretaker burst into the parish hall. His face was pale. His hands trembled. "The vicar," he gasped. Something in his voice emptied the room of conversation instantly. "What is it?" Margaret Henshaw demanded. The caretaker swallowed hard. "Important. He's in the bell tower." Within seconds, dozens of villagers rushed toward the church. Miss Marple arrived among the first. The narrow staircase leading to the tower was crowded with frightened faces. At the top lay Reverend Peter Langley, motionless, dead. Shock swept through Willowbrook. No one understood what had happened. Some believed he had fallen. Others whispered of an accident, but as the village doctor knelt beside the body, his expression grew grim. Very grim indeed, because Reverend Langley's death had not been accidental. And while frightened villagers stared at the body, Miss Marple found herself looking elsewhere. Near the bell rope, partially hidden beneath a wooden cabinet, lay a torn photograph. Most people overlooked it entirely. Miss Marple did not, because the photograph appeared to show Reverend Langley standing beside two other individuals many years earlier. And someone had very deliberately torn one of those faces away. Important. The news of Reverend Peter Langley's death spread through Willowbrook before sunrise. By morning, every cottage, shop, and lane buzzed with speculation. The annual parish heritage fair, which had begun as a celebration, had become the setting of a murder. Inspector Daniel Graves arrived shortly after dawn. A practical and methodical investigator, he immediately secured the church bell tower and began interviewing witnesses. The village doctor had already confirmed that the vicar had not fallen accidentally. A severe blow to the back of his head had caused his death before he collapsed near the bell rope. The discovery transformed the case completely. Someone had murdered the vicar. The question was who and why. The bell tower itself offered few answers. There were no obvious signs of struggle. The narrow staircase allowed only limited access, and dozens of people had been moving around the church grounds throughout the evening. Opportunity existed for many individuals. Important. As Inspector Graves questioned villagers, attention quickly focused on the mysterious stranger. No one seemed able to identify him. Several guests remembered seeing him speak privately with Reverend Langley. Others recalled noticing the vicar's obvious discomfort after their conversation. The stranger had vanished shortly after the body was discovered. That fact alone made him an obvious suspect. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat quietly in the parish hall, listening to conversations as villagers shared theories. People often revealed useful information while gossiping. Mrs. Eleanor Finch believed the stranger must have been a blackmailer. The village baker suggested the man might have been connected to an old church dispute. Another resident insisted the vicar had been hiding financial problems. The theories multiplied rapidly. Facts remained scarce. Later that morning, Inspector Graves interviewed Margaret Henshaw. The parish council chairwoman appeared exhausted. Important. She answered questions politely but seemed unusually tense. "How well did you know Reverend Langley?" The inspector asked. "Very well." "You worked closely together?" "Of course." "Did he seem worried recently?" Margaret hesitated. "A little." "Interesting. What worried him?" "I'm not certain." The answer sounded incomplete. Not exactly false, simply incomplete. Inspector Graves noticed it as well. Before ending the interview, he showed her the torn photograph found in the bell tower. The reaction was immediate. Margaret's expression changed, only briefly, but long enough. "You recognize it?" Graves asked. "No." The answer came too quickly, much too quickly. Miss Marple, observing from nearby, quietly stored the reaction in her memory. People often lied with their faces before they lied with words. That afternoon, another discovery emerged. The torn photograph was examined more carefully. Important. Although one face had been deliberately removed, the remaining image clearly showed Reverend Langley as a much younger man. Standing beside him was Margaret Henshaw. The photograph appeared to be at least 20 years old. Interesting indeed. Very interesting. Inspector Graves arranged another conversation with Margaret. This time he placed the photograph on the table between them. "You still don't recognize it?" Margaret stared at the image, then sighed. "Yes." "You lied earlier." "Yes." "Why?" She looked down. "Because I didn't think it mattered. A familiar answer, often untrue. What is the photograph? It was taken years ago. Where? At another parish. Inspector Graves leaned forward. And the missing person? Margaret became visibly uncomfortable. I don't know. Again, the answer sounded incomplete. When the interview concluded, Miss Marple found herself increasingly interested in the torn photograph, not because of what remained, because of what was missing. Important, someone had gone to considerable effort to remove a single face. That suggested significance. The missing person mattered, very much. As evening approached, Inspector Graves received an unexpected report from the church caretaker. The caretaker recalled seeing the stranger enter the church shortly before the murder. More importantly, he remembered hearing raised voices from inside, not shouting, but certainly an argument. Could you hear what was said? The inspector asked. No, nothing at all. The caretaker frowned. One thing. What? I heard the stranger say, you should have told them years ago. Silence followed. A curious statement. You should have told them years ago. Not the language of robbery, not the language of revenge. The language of secrets, old secrets. As darkness settled over Willowbrook once more, Miss Marple reviewed everything she had learned. The stranger's arrival, the vicar's fear, Margaret Henshaw's obvious discomfort, the torn photograph, important, and a heated conversation centered on something that should have been revealed long ago. The pieces did not yet fit together, but one thing seemed increasingly certain. Reverend Peter Langley's murder was not connected to anything recent. Whatever had happened inside the bell tower had begun many years earlier, and somewhere within Willowbrook Parish lay a secret that someone had spent decades trying to keep buried. Important. The following morning, Willowbrook awoke beneath a blanket of grey clouds and persistent drizzle. The weather did little to dampen the village's appetite for speculation. Everywhere Miss Marple went, she heard conversations about Reverend Langley's murder. Most theories focused upon the stranger. His sudden appearance, argument with the vicar, and equally sudden disappearance seemed too suspicious to ignore. Inspector Graves agreed that the man remained a person of interest. Unfortunately, identifying him proved difficult. No one knew his name, no one knew where he had come from, and no one had seen him leave the village. The mystery deepened further when a local innkeeper reported that a guest matching the stranger's description had checked into a nearby hotel 2 nights before the parish heritage fair. The registration card contained a name, David Mercer. Unfortunately, the address provided appeared false. Interesting indeed. Important. The inspector immediately began tracing every available lead. Meanwhile, Miss Marple devoted her attention elsewhere. The torn photograph continued troubling her. Not merely because someone had removed a face, because Margaret Henshaw had lied about recognizing it. People often conceal facts for one of 2 reasons. Either the truth implicated them, or the truth implicated someone they wished to protect. That distinction mattered. Late that morning, Miss Marple visited Margaret at her cottage. The parish council chairwoman welcomed her politely, though obvious nervousness lingered beneath her smile. After a brief discussion about village affairs and the unfortunate weather, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward the past. You and Reverend Langley knew one another for many years. Margaret hesitated. Yes. Long before Willowbrook? Yes. Interesting. Was that photograph taken at your first parish together? Margaret looked startled. Then she sighed. Important. There seems little point denying it. No. For a moment she stared into her teacup. It was taken 22 years ago. And the missing person? Margaret immediately grew tense again. I'd rather not discuss that. A revealing answer. Miss Marple pressed no further. There was little value in forcing confessions prematurely. People often revealed more when left alone with their thoughts. That afternoon brought another development. Inspector Graves received a report from the bank. Reverend Langley had withdrawn a substantial amount of money 3 days before his death. The transaction surprised everyone. The vicar was not a wealthy man, nor was he known for extravagant spending. The missing funds had not been recovered. Naturally, some investigators immediately suspected blackmail. The theory gained popularity quickly, too quickly perhaps. Miss Marple remained unconvinced. Blackmail was certainly possible, yet something about the case felt more complicated. more personal. Important. That evening another witness emerged. The church organist, Mrs. Clara Benton, reluctantly admitted overhearing part of a conversation between Reverend Langley and Margaret Henshaw several days before the fair.
"What did you hear?"
Inspector Graves asked. Mrs. Benton shifted uneasily. "Not much, but something." "Yes." "What?" The organist hesitated. Then she answered. "Margaret said, if he comes back, everything will come out." The room fell silent. "Interesting. Very interesting indeed. Who was she referring to?" asked Graves. "I don't know." "Did Reverend Langley respond?" "Yes." "What did he say?" Mrs. Benton frowned, trying to remember. "He said, 'We've lived with it this long.'" The statement generated more questions than answers. What exactly had they lived with? What secret connected them? And who was expected to return? That night, Inspector Graves finally located David Mercer. Or rather, he located the man who had registered under that name. Important, the real David Mercer had been dead for nearly 10 years. The identity was stolen, which meant the stranger had deliberately concealed who he truly was. The revelation intensified suspicion immediately. Yet Miss Marple found herself focusing on something else. If the stranger wished to avoid attention, why attend a crowded village event? Why speak openly with Reverend Langley? Why allow dozens of witnesses to observe their meeting? The behavior seemed contradictory, almost as though the stranger wanted to be noticed. An unusual thought, but not impossible. As darkness settled across Willowbrook, Miss Marple sat quietly by the window of Eleanor Finch's cottage. The case was beginning to reveal its emotional structure: fear, secrecy, old loyalties, long-buried guilt. Margaret Henshaw clearly knew more than she admitted. Reverend Langley had feared the stranger's arrival. Money had changed hands shortly before the murder. Important. And someone from their shared past appeared to have returned after more than 20 years. The pieces remained incomplete, yet one conclusion seemed increasingly unavoidable. The murder was not motivated by money, nor by opportunity. It was rooted in something much older, something capable of surviving decades. And somewhere within the history of Willowbrook Parish was a forgotten event that at least 3 people had spent years desperately trying to hide. Important. The 4th day of the investigation brought the first genuine breakthrough. Until now, Inspector Graves had been assembling fragments of information that seemed related but refused to form a complete picture. The murder, the torn photograph, the stranger's arrival, and the obvious anxiety displayed by both Reverend Langley and Margaret Henshaw all pointed toward a shared secret buried somewhere in the past. That morning, a retired bishop named Harold Whitmore contacted the police after hearing news of the murder. His call immediately attracted attention. The bishop had once overseen the parish where Reverend Langley and Margaret Henshaw first met. More importantly, he remembered the third person from the torn photograph. Inspector Graves arranged an interview at once. The elderly bishop examined the photograph carefully before nodding. "Yes, I remember them." "Who is the missing person?" Graves asked. The bishop hesitated. "A young woman named Susan Bell." Important. The name meant nothing to most people, yet Margaret Henshaw's reaction when informed of the identification spoke volumes. She became visibly pale. Interesting indeed. Very interesting. "What was Susan Bell's role in the parish?" asked the inspector. "She worked as a church secretary." "Anything unusual about her?" The bishop looked uncomfortable. "There was a scandal." The room fell silent. "What kind of scandal?" The bishop sighed heavily. "She disappeared." Those words immediately transformed the investigation. "A missing person?" "Yes." "When?" 22 years ago. The timing matched perfectly. The photograph, the shared parish, the years of secrecy, everything. The bishop continued. "At the time, there were many rumors. Some people believed she had left voluntarily. Others suspected something else." "What else?" "No one knew." A curious answer, and perhaps a dangerous one. That afternoon, Inspector Graves confronted Margaret Henshaw once again. Important. This time he mentioned Susan Bell directly. The effect was immediate. Margaret's composure finally cracked. For several moments she could not speak. Then she whispered, "I knew this would happen eventually." Interesting. Very interesting indeed. What happened to Susan Bell? asked the inspector. Margaret stared at the floor. "I don't know." The answer sounded sincere, at least partly. "But you know more than you've told us." "Yes," a significant admission. "What do you know?" Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Then she spoke. "Susan was my friend." The statement carried genuine emotion. "We worked together. And—" Margaret hesitated. She and Peter were close. The revelation immediately shifted attention toward the dead vicar. "Close in what sense?" Graves asked. Margaret looked away. "They were in love." Silence filled the room. The respected Reverend Peter Langley, the missing church secretary, a vanished woman. Suddenly the old scandal began taking shape. Important. Did they intend to marry? Yes. What happened? Margaret shook her head. "That's the problem. What is? Nobody knows. Again, always uncertain, always missing pieces." Later that evening, another witness emerged unexpectedly. A former parish caretaker named William Foster had recently moved into a retirement home several counties away. After hearing about the murder, he contacted authorities with information he had never previously shared. His statement proved remarkable. "I saw Susan Bell on the night she disappeared." Inspector Graves leaned forward. "Where?" "Near the church." "Alone?" William hesitated. "No." "Who was with her?" The old man frowned. "Peter Langley." The room became very quiet. What were they doing? Arguing. Another argument. Another secret. A familiar pattern. "Did you hear what they said?" "Only part of it." "What part?" William thought carefully, then answered. "Susan kept saying you promised you'd tell the truth." "Important. Interesting indeed. A promise. A truth." And now, decades later, another man had accused Reverend Langley of hiding something that should have been revealed long ago. The similarity was impossible to ignore. That night, Miss Marple sat beside the fire at Eleanor Finch's cottage and reflected upon the growing pattern. Susan Bell disappeared. Peter Langley was the last known person to see her. Margaret Henshaw concealed information about her. A stranger arrived 22 years later demanding answers, and within hours the vicar was dead. The connection seemed obvious, perhaps too obvious. That thought troubled her. People often became so focused on a dramatic mystery that they overlooked quieter truths. As she reviewed every conversation and observation, another detail resurfaced in her memory. The fear, not merely the vicar's fear, Margaret's as well. Neither behaved like people worried about being exposed for wrongdoing. Important. They behaved like people terrified that something forgotten was about to return, something they had never truly understood. As midnight approached, Miss Marple found herself wondering about Susan Bell. Everyone assumed her disappearance was the central mystery, but what if it wasn't? What if Susan herself had discovered something important before she vanished, something worth hiding for 22 years? And what if Reverend Langley's murder had far less to do with the woman who disappeared than with the secret she may have uncovered before she left? Important. The 5th day of the investigation began with a growing sense of unease throughout Willowbrook. What had started as a murder inquiry was steadily transforming into the examination of events buried more than 2 decades in the past. For Inspector Graves, that presented both an opportunity and a problem. Old secrets had a habit of leaving few witnesses and even fewer records. Yet those same secrets often supplied the strongest motives. That morning, detectives traveled to the parish where Reverend Langley, Margaret Henshaw, and Susan Bell had once worked together. Their search uncovered several boxes of archived church records that had remained untouched for years. Most contained routine paperwork. One file did not. Inside was a collection of correspondence relating to Susan Bell's disappearance. The documents revealed something surprising. Susan had not simply vanished. She had resigned from her position only 3 days before she disappeared. Important. The resignation letter was brief but unusual. It stated that she could no longer remain in a place where certain truths were being ignored. Interesting indeed. Very interesting. Inspector Graves studied the phrase repeatedly. What truths? Ignored by whom? And why? The letter raised more questions than it answered. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple accompanied Eleanor Finch to the parish hall, where villagers continued gathering to discuss developments in the case. As always, Gossip proved remarkably informative. One conversation in particular attracted her attention. Two elderly residents were discussing Susan Bell. "I remember her," one woman said. "So do I. They always blamed Peter, not openly, no." "Interesting." Miss Marple listened carefully. The first woman lowered her voice. "There were rumors." "What sort of rumors?" "That Susan was frightened before she disappeared." "Fear again." "Always fear." The second woman nodded. "I heard the same thing." Important. Neither woman possessed concrete evidence, yet their memories aligned with the pattern already emerging. Susan Bell had been worried about something. Something important enough to leave her position. Something important enough to confront Reverend Langley. That evening, Inspector Graves received another unexpected lead. A solicitor's office located an old storage box belonging to Susan Bell's late aunt. Among the contents were several letters written shortly before Susan vanished. Most appeared ordinary. One stood out immediately. The letter had never been mailed. It seemed unfinished. Yet the contents were revealing. Susan wrote that she intended to expose a deception affecting multiple people within the parish. She never explained what the deception involved. The letter ended abruptly, as though interrupted or abandoned. The discovery sent fresh excitement through the investigation. Once again, the focus shifted away from romance and towards secrecy. Important. Miss Marple found that development encouraging. People were often too eager to interpret mysteries through dramatic relationships. The truth was frequently more complicated. That night, another interview with Margaret Henshaw produced significant results. Inspector Graves showed her the unfinished letter. Margaret stared at it for a long time. Then tears appeared in her eyes. "I should have said something years ago. A remarkable statement." "What should you have said?" asked the inspector. Margaret hesitated, then answered. "Susan believes someone was stealing money." The room fell silent. Interesting indeed. "Very interesting." "From the church?" Graves asked. "Yes." "Who?" "I don't know." The answer sounded genuine. But Susan thought she knew. When did she discover this? Shortly before she left, a new possibility emerged immediately. Perhaps Susan Bell's disappearance and Reverend Langley's murder were both connected to financial wrongdoing. Perhaps. Important. Yet Miss Marple remained uncertain. Something about the theory felt incomplete. Too simple. People did not generally carry fear for 22 years because of missing church funds. Human beings carried emotional burdens for far longer than financial ones. As darkness settled over Willowbrook, Miss Marple reviewed the growing list of facts. Susan Bell had resigned unexpectedly. She believed important truths were being ignored. She suspected financial misconduct. She confronted Reverend Langley. Then she disappeared. 22 years later, a mysterious stranger returned. The vicar became frightened. An argument followed. And within hours he was dead. The pattern was becoming clearer. Yet one crucial detail continued bothering her. Everyone assumed Susan Bell vanished because of what she discovered. But what if the opposite were true? What if Susan's disappearance created the deception she later intended to expose? The distinction was subtle, but potentially important. Important. Very important indeed. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple found herself returning once again to the torn photograph. 3 people, 1 face removed. Such deliberate damage suggested anger, personal anger, not merely curiosity. Someone wanted Susan Bell erased from the picture. The question was why. And Miss Marple increasingly suspected that the answer lay not in Susan's disappearance itself, but in what happened immediately after she was gone. Important. The 6th day of the investigation brought a development that altered the direction of the case once again. For nearly a week, everyone had focused on Susan Bell's disappearance and Reverend Langley's murder. Now, for the first time, evidence emerged that connected the two events in a way nobody had anticipated. The discovery came from an old accounting ledger found among parish archives. At first glance, the records appeared ordinary. Church donations, maintenance expenses, routine transactions. Yet a closer examination revealed several unexplained withdrawals made over a period of nearly 3 years. The amounts were not enormous, but they were consistent, and they stopped abruptly just before Susan Bell disappeared. Interesting indeed. Inspector Graves immediately arranged for the documents to be reviewed. The dates aligned perfectly with Susan's growing concerns about financial irregularities. It seemed increasingly likely that she had discovered something important. The question remained whether that discovery had anything to do with her disappearance. Later that morning, another witness emerged. A retired church treasurer named Leonard Briggs contacted the police after hearing details of the investigation. His memory proved surprisingly sharp. "I remember Susan asking questions." "What kind of questions?" asked Inspector Graves. "Questions about money." "Interesting. Specific money?" "Yes." "What did she think she'd found?" Leonard hesitated, then answered carefully. "She believed someone was using church funds for private purposes." The statement generated immediate interest. "Did she name anyone?" "No." "Did you suspect anyone?" The old man looked uncomfortable. "At the time, number, and now." Leonard sighed. "Now I'm not so certain." The interview ended without definitive conclusions, but it strengthened the growing impression that Susan Bell had been pursuing something important before she vanished. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk through the village. As she passed the churchyard, she encountered Margaret Henshaw sitting alone on a bench. The parish council chairwoman appeared exhausted. Days of interviews and old memories had clearly worn her down. After exchanging polite greetings, the conversation gradually turned toward Susan Bell. Margaret stared toward the church tower for several moments before speaking. "She trusted people too easily." An interesting remark. "Did she?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes." Margaret folded her hands tightly. "She always believed the truth would fix everything." The statement lingered in the air. A moment later, Margaret added something else. "Sometimes it doesn't." Very interesting indeed. There was genuine sadness in her voice. Not fear, not guilt. Sadness. Miss Marple noticed the distinction immediately. People grieving a mistake often sounded different from people hiding a crime. Important. As the afternoon continued, Inspector Graves received another report concerning the mysterious stranger. At last, investigators had identified him. His real name was Thomas Bell. The surname immediately attracted attention. Bell, Susan Bell. The connection seemed obvious. Further inquiries confirmed it. Thomas Bell was Susan's younger brother. The revelation sent shockwaves through Willowbrook. For nearly a week, villagers had speculated endlessly about the stranger's identity. Now they had an answer. And with it came new questions. Why had Thomas returned after 22 years? What had he hoped to learn? And what had he discussed with Reverend Langley shortly before the murder? That evening, Inspector Graves located Thomas Bell at a neighboring village. The man offered no resistance. In fact, he appeared relieved. Relieved, an unexpected reaction. During questioning, Thomas spoke openly for the first time. "I came because I wanted answers." "About your sister?" "Yes." "Important. What answers?" Thomas looked toward the window. "For 22 years, nobody could tell me what happened to Susan." The frustration in his voice felt genuine. "Did you believe Reverend Langley knew?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because Susan wrote to me." "Interesting indeed, very interesting." Inspector Graves leaned forward. "She wrote to you before she disappeared?" "Yes." "Do you still have the letter?" Thomas nodded. The letter was produced shortly afterward. Its contents immediately captured everyone's attention. Susan mentioned discovering something important within the parish. More significantly, she wrote that she planned to confront someone she once trusted completely. The name was not included, but the implication was unmistakable. Someone close to her, someone she believed had betrayed her. As darkness settled across Willowbrook, Miss Marple sat quietly reviewing the latest developments. Thomas Bell's arrival now made perfect sense. Important. He had returned seeking the truth about his sister, not revenge. Truth. Just as Michael Trent had sought truth in another village many years earlier. Yet one detail continued troubling her. If Susan Bell had discovered financial wrongdoing, why had nobody ever benefited from exposing it afterward? Why had the matter vanished completely along with her? The more she considered the question, the less convincing the financial motive became. Money might explain what Susan investigated. It did not explain the emotions surrounding the case. The fear, the guilt, the decades of silence. Something more personal lay hidden beneath the missing funds. and Miss Marple increasingly suspected that Susan Bell's disappearance had not merely concealed a secret, it had created one. Important. The seventh day of the investigation began with a noticeable shift in atmosphere. For the first time since Reverend Langley's death, the mystery no longer revolved around an unknown stranger. Thomas Bell's identity had been established, and his reasons for returning to Willowbrook appeared genuine. Yet his arrival had accomplished something unexpected. It had forced old memories into the open. People who had remained silent for decades were beginning to talk. Inspector Graves spent much of the morning reviewing Susan Bell's letter. The document contained no direct accusations, but certain phrases stood out. She spoke repeatedly of betrayal, of disappointment, of discovering that someone she trusted was not the person she believed them to be. Interestingly, she devoted very little attention to money. The financial irregularities appeared almost secondary. That detail caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. People often focused on facts when discussing finances. Important. They focused on emotions when discussing personal wounds. Susan's letter contained far more emotion than accounting. Later that morning, Thomas Bell agreed to another interview. This time, Inspector Graves asked questions about Susan's personal life before her disappearance. Thomas answered carefully. "My sister admired Peter Langley." "Admired?" "Yes." "Because of their relationship?" Thomas hesitated. "Not exactly." "Interesting." "What do you mean?" "She respected him. The distinction mattered. A great deal." Thomas stared at the table. "She used to say he was the most honest man she had ever known." The statement lingered in the room. An uncomfortable statement, particularly considering everything that followed. "Did that change?" asked Graves. "Yes." "When?" "Shortly before she disappeared." Another important piece slid quietly into place. Susan had not merely discovered something troubling. She had discovered something that shattered her trust in Reverend Langley. Important. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the church archives herself. She had no expectation of uncovering dramatic evidence. Instead, she sought context, patterns, small details, the sort of things other people overlooked. After nearly an hour of reviewing old parish newsletters and committee records, she found something interesting. Very interesting indeed. 22 years earlier, shortly before Susan vanished, a charitable restoration fund had been established. The project never proceeded. The money disappeared from parish records within months. Officially, the fund had been cancelled. Unofficially, nobody seemed able to explain what happened to the donations. The missing money itself was not particularly remarkable. What caught Miss Marple's attention was the committee responsible for managing it. Only 3 names appeared: Peter Langley, Margaret Henshaw, Susan Bell. 3 people. The same 3 people from the torn photograph. Important. As evening approached, Inspector Graves received another valuable statement. A former resident named Judith Carver came forward after hearing reports on the radio. 22 years earlier, she had worked briefly at the parish office. Her memory of events surrounding Susan's disappearance remained surprisingly clear. "There was an argument," she said. "Between whom?" asked Graves. "Susan and Margaret." The revelation surprised everyone. Until now, attention had focused almost entirely on Susan and Reverend Langley. "What was the argument about?" "I couldn't hear everything." "Anything?" Judith nodded. "One sentence." "What sentence?" "She said you helped him hide it." Silence followed. "Interesting indeed." "Very interesting." "You're certain?" "Yes." "Who said it?" "Susan." "And who was she talking about?" "Margaret." The statement dramatically altered the investigation. If true, Margaret Henshaw knew far more than she had admitted. Perhaps far more. Important. That evening, Inspector Graves confronted Margaret again. Exhaustion showed plainly on her face. Years of buried memories were becoming impossible to contain. When asked about Judith Carver's account, Margaret closed her eyes. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she nodded. "Yes." "You argued with Susan?" "Yes." "Why?" Margaret's voice became barely audible. "Because she wouldn't let it go." "What wouldn't she let go?" "The truth." A revealing answer. "What truth?" Margaret looked toward the window. "I can't tell you." "Can't or won't?" The question hung heavily in the air. Finally, she whispered, "Both." When the interview ended, Inspector Graves appeared frustrated. Miss Marple did not. In fact, she felt oddly encouraged. Margaret was no longer denying facts. She was protecting something, and protection often revealed more than denial. Late that night, Miss Marple sat alone, knitting quietly while reviewing every major event. Susan Bell discovered something important. She confronted both Peter Langley and Margaret Henshaw. An argument followed. Soon afterward, she vanished. 22 years later, her brother returned seeking answers. Then Reverend Langley was murdered. The sequence itself seemed straightforward, yet one element continued troubling her. Everyone assumed Susan Bell had been a victim. What if that assumption was wrong? Not wrong in the moral sense, wrong in the practical sense. Perhaps Susan had not simply disappeared because she uncovered a secret. Perhaps she had chosen to disappear. If so, everything changed. Because the most dangerous secrets were not always hidden by those who committed them. Sometimes they were hidden by those who discovered them first. Important. The 8th day of the investigation began with a revelation that stunned both Inspector Graves and the residents of Willowbrook. For more than a week, everyone had operated under a single assumption. Susan Bell had disappeared and never been heard from again. That assumption was about to collapse. The discovery came from a solicitor's office in Devon. After hearing details of the investigation, a clerk recognized Susan Bell's name from an old estate file. The records indicated that a woman named Susan Bell had legally changed her surname less than a year after her disappearance. More importantly, she had remained alive for nearly 15 years afterward. The news spread rapidly through the investigation team. Susan Bell had not vanished. She had left voluntarily. Inspector Graves immediately obtained copies of the relevant documents. The records were genuine. There could be little doubt. Important. Susan had relocated to another county, adopted a new life, and severed all contact with her former parish. The implications were enormous. For 22 years, people had treated her disappearance as a mystery. Now it appears to have been a decision. Yet the revelation created as many questions as it answered. Why leave without informing her family? Why allow her brother to spend decades searching for answers? And why had Reverend Langley never revealed the truth? That afternoon, Thomas Bell received the news in stunned silence. For several moments after hearing it, he said nothing. Then he asked a single question. Did Peter know? A fair question, perhaps the most important one. The answer arrived later that day. Among newly recovered records was a letter written by Susan several months after she left. The letter had been addressed to Reverend Langley. Its contents transformed the case once again. Susan confirmed that she had chosen to leave voluntarily. Important, she asked him not to reveal her location, and she stated that she wished to leave the past behind forever. Interesting indeed. Very interesting. The letter seemed genuine. Yet one section attracted particular attention. Susan wrote that she could never forgive what had happened, but neither could she bear the consequences of exposing it. The statement immediately reignited speculation. What exactly had happened? What secret had driven her away? As evening approached, Miss Marple reviewed the latest developments with great interest. The emotional structure of the mystery was finally becoming clearer. Susan had not been fleeing danger, she had been fleeing disappointment. The distinction mattered enormously. People escaping danger sought protection. People escaping betrayal sought distance. That difference altered everything. Later that evening, another piece of evidence surfaced. Among Susan's personal effects was a second letter that had never been sent. Important, this one was addressed to Margaret Henshaw. Unlike the first letter, it was remarkably direct. Susan accused Margaret of helping conceal a deception, yet she also expressed sympathy. The tone was curious, not hatred, not even anger, more sadness than anything else. Miss Marple found that particularly revealing. Human beings rarely wrote sorrowful letters to people they believed responsible for serious crimes. The emotion suggested something more complicated, a moral failure rather than a criminal one. As darkness settled over Willowbrook, Inspector Graves arranged another meeting with Margaret Henshaw. This time he presented both letters. Margaret read them slowly. When she finished, tears filled her eyes. "I never wanted any of this." The statement sounded sincere. "What happened?" Graves asked. For a long moment, Margaret remained silent. Then she answered, Peter made a terrible mistake. Interesting. What mistake? Margaret shook her head. I can't explain it properly. Important. Try. She looked exhausted. 22 years of silence seemed to weigh heavily upon her. Finally she whispered, he thought he was protecting people. A familiar phrase. One Miss Marple had heard many times throughout her life. Some of the greatest disasters began with good intentions. What people? Asked Graves. Margaret stared into the distance. Everyone. The answer frustrated the inspector. Yet Miss Marple understood something important. Margaret was not protecting Reverend Langley anymore. She was protecting his memory. And that suggested a critical distinction. Whatever Peter Langley had done, Margaret did not believe him capable of murder. Nor, increasingly, did Miss Marple. Late that night, while reviewing every statement collected during the investigation, Miss Marple finally noticed a pattern she had overlooked. The case contained two separate mysteries. Everyone had been treating them as one. Susan Bell's departure and Reverend Langley's murder. Connected? Important? Certainly. Identical? Perhaps not. The realization struck her with surprising force. If Susan willingly left Willowbrook, then the emotional motive that drove Thomas Bell back to the village vanished immediately. His search for answers made sense. Murder did not. Number. Someone else had a stronger reason to kill Reverend Langley. Someone affected not by Susan's disappearance, but by the truth she had uncovered before she left. And for the first time since the investigation began, Miss Marple believed she knew where to look. Important. The 9th day of the investigation opened with a sense of urgency. For the first time, Miss Marple felt the truth was within reach. The various pieces of the puzzle, scattered across more than 2 decades, were beginning to form a coherent picture. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, continued examining the evidence recovered from Susan Bell's correspondence. The letters had changed everything. Susan had not disappeared under mysterious circumstances. She had chosen to leave. That fact alone eliminated many of the assumptions that had guided the investigation from the beginning. Yet Reverend Langley was still dead, and someone had killed him for a reason. That morning, Miss Marple requested access to all available records concerning the abandoned restoration fund. The financial discrepancies had largely faded into the background as attention shifted towards Susan's departure, but Miss Marple believed they remained important. Not because of the missing money itself, important, because of the behavior surrounding it. The records revealed something curious. The missing funds had eventually been repaid, quietly, gradually. Over several years, the repayments came from a private account belonging to Reverend Langley. Interesting indeed, very interesting. The discovery suggested that Peter Langley had accepted responsibility for whatever irregularities had occurred. Yet the records also showed something else. The amounts repaid exceeded the money originally missing. By a considerable margin. That detail troubled Miss Marple. People repaid debts. They overpaid when burdened by guilt. Shortly after noon, she met privately with Margaret Henshaw. The older woman appeared emotionally exhausted. Days of questioning had stripped away much of her resistance. Miss Marple spoke gently. "You've been protecting Peter for 22 years. Margaret looked down. Yes. Why? For a long moment she said nothing. Then she answered, "Because he didn't deserve what happened." Important. An interesting choice of words. Not innocent, not justification. Something more complicated. Miss Marple asked quietly. Margaret closed her eyes. Finally the truth began to emerge. 22 years earlier, Susan Bell had discovered that money from the restoration fund had been diverted, not by Peter Langley, by another member of the parish committee. When Susan confronted the individual, panic followed. The matter threatened reputations, careers, and several families. Peter had stepped forward and accepted responsibility publicly, believing the issue could be resolved quietly without destroying lives. A terrible decision, but not a criminal one. He thought he was helping, Margaret whispered. Yes, he always thought he could fix things. Miss Marple nodded. Many people made precisely that mistake. They confused concealment with kindness. What happened after Susan learned the truth? Margaret stared at the floor. She lost faith in all of us. Important. The answer explained much. Susan had not left because she feared physical harm. She left because she no longer trusted the people around her. particularly those she once admired. That afternoon, Inspector Graves received a report concerning the torn photograph found in the bell tower. Advances in image restoration had revealed faint traces of writing on the back, a date, and 3 initials. PLMH in a third set. RC. Interesting indeed. Very interesting. The initials match neither Susan Bell nor any previously identified figure in the case. Inspector Graves immediately launched inquiries. The results arrived faster than expected. RC stood for Robert Canning, a former church administrator, the very individual who had overseen financial matters during the period in question. More importantly, Robert Canning was still alive, and living less than 40 miles away. The revelation transformed the investigation. Within hours, detectives interviewed him. Important. At first, Canning denied everything. Then evidence accumulated: old financial records, witness statements, Susan's letters. Gradually, his confidence began to crumble. By evening, he admitted the truth. Years earlier, he had diverted parish funds to cover mounting personal debts. When Susan discovered the discrepancies, panic followed. Peter Langley intervened, hoping to prevent public scandal. Susan left shortly afterward. The financial losses were eventually repaid through Peter's own sacrifices, a tragedy of misplaced loyalty. Yet one crucial question remained unanswered. Why kill Reverend Langley now? The answer emerged unexpectedly during the final moments of the interview. Robert Canning revealed that Thomas Bell had visited him before the parish heritage fair. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, and afterward Canning became terrified. Terrified enough to travel secretly to Willowbrook on the day of the fair, terrified enough to confront Peter Langley personally. Important. Miss Marple listened carefully as the details emerged. At last, the final pieces settled into place. The old theft, Susan's departure, Thomas Bell's return, the argument inside the church, the murder, everything connected. And by the time darkness settled over Willowbrook, Miss Marple knew exactly who had killed Reverend Langley. More importantly, she knew why. The following evening, she asked Inspector Graves to gather everyone connected to the case inside the parish hall. After 22 years of silence, the complete truth was finally ready to be revealed. Important. The following evening, the parish hall filled with an uneasy silence. Rain pattered softly against the windows, and the familiar room that had hosted countless village gatherings now felt more like a courtroom. Inspector Graves stood near the front of the room. Margaret Henshaw sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap. Thomas Bell occupied a chair near the back, his expression tense. Several parish officials and long-time villagers had also been invited. At the center of the gathering sat Miss Marple. She appeared as calm as ever. When everyone had settled, Inspector Graves addressed the room. Miss Marple has asked that we all meet here because she believes the circumstances surrounding Reverend Langley's death can now be fully explained. A murmur passed through the audience. Miss Marple smiled gently. The story begins 22 years ago, but not in the way many of us first imagined. She looked toward Thomas Bell. Important. For years, people believed Susan Bell disappeared under mysterious circumstances. That assumption shaped every theory that followed. Thomas nodded quietly. But Susan was not murdered. She chose to leave. The room remained silent. She left because she discovered a painful truth. Money had been stolen from the parish restoration fund by Robert Canning. Several villagers exchanged surprised glances. Reverend Langley discovered the theft as well, Miss Marple continued. Unfortunately, he made a serious mistake. Believing he could prevent scandal and protect innocent people, he concealed the matter and quietly repaid the missing funds himself over many years. Margaret lowered her eyes. He thought he was helping. Yes, said Miss Marple gently, but concealment rarely solves a problem. It simply postpones it, she continued. Susan Bell lost faith in people she trusted. Rather than expose the scandal publicly, she chose to leave Willowbrook and begin a new life elsewhere. Important. Thomas stared at the floor. For 22 years, her family never knew the truth. A heavy silence settled across the room. Then Miss Marple turned her attention elsewhere. Years later, Thomas Bell returned, seeking answers about his sister. His inquiries eventually led him to Robert Canning. Inspector Graves nodded. We confirmed the meeting. Quite so. Miss Marple folded her hands. That meeting frightened Mr. Canning enormously. He realized old secrets might finally come to light. Several people glanced nervously toward one another. On the day of the parish heritage fair, Robert Canning came to Willowbrook. He arranged to meet Reverend Langley inside the church. The room grew very still. At first he claimed the meeting never happened. Later evidence proved otherwise. Miss Marple paused. During that conversation, Reverend Langley informed him that he intended to tell the truth at last. Margaret looked up sharply. The statement clearly surprised her. Important. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. After all these years, Peter had finally concluded that honesty was long overdue. She turned toward Inspector Graves. The difficulty for Mr. Canning was obvious. Once the truth emerged, his reputation would be destroyed. His theft would become public knowledge. Everything he had spent 22 years hiding would be exposed. Graves nodded. The motive? Exactly. Miss Marple continued. The argument escalated. The two men went up to the bell tower. There, in a moment of panic and desperation, Robert Canning struck Reverend Langley from behind. Several villagers gasped. The blow killed him instantly. Silence followed. A long silence. Finally, Inspector Graves spoke. Robert Canning confessed this afternoon. The room seemed to exhale all at once. The mystery that had haunted Willowbrook for days was finally over. Thomas Bell sat motionless for several moments. Then he asked quietly, "And Susan?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Important. Your sister lived for many years after leaving Willowbrook. The evidence suggests she built a peaceful life. She carried disappointment with her. Certainly. But she also found freedom." Thomas nodded slowly. For the first time since arriving in the village, some of the tension left his face. As the gathering dispersed, villagers spoke quietly among themselves. The truth was painful, but at least it was finally known. Several days later, Robert Canning was formally charged, and life in Willowbrook gradually returned to normal. The church bells rang once more. The parish hall reopened. Conversations shifted back to ordinary village concerns. On her final afternoon in Willowbrook, Miss Marple sat beneath an old oak tree overlooking the churchyard. Human nature, she reflected, remained remarkably consistent. Most tragedies began not with cruelty but with fear. Fear of embarrassment, fear of loss, fear of consequences. People convinced themselves that silence protected others. Important. Yet secrets possessed a stubborn quality. They lingered, they grew, and eventually they demanded payment. As the church bell sounded softly across the village, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose to leave. The mystery of Willowbrook Parish had finally ended, but the lesson behind it was one she had learned many times before. The truth might arrive late, yet sooner or later it always arrived.